While you think small towns are peaceful, Appalachian communities once hired mercenaries and built actual fortresses to fight railroad companies. The question isn't why they fought, it's how these backward mountain folk outsmarted America's richest industrial giants. The mountains of Appalachia had been quiet for centuries, then the iron horse came thundering through. When railroads first snaked into these valleys during the mid-1800s, they didn't just bring trains, they brought complete chaos. Towns that had existed peacefully for generations suddenly found themselves connected to places hundreds of miles away. A farmer in rural Virginia could now ship his goods to Philadelphia. A blacksmith in Tennessee could receive steel from Pittsburgh. The world had shrunk overnight. But here's the thing nobody talks about: building these railroad lines was basically a death sentence for many workers. The mountains didn't want to be conquered. Rocky cliffs had to be blasted apart with primitive explosives. Workers dangled from ropes, hammering spikes into seemingly impossible angles. Landslides buried entire crews without warning. Makes sense why so many railroad graveyards dot these hills, right? The companies didn't care much about the human cost, though they had bigger plans. Every mile of track meant more money, more control, more power. And the weird part is, they were creating towns almost by accident. Wherever they decided to lay tracks, settlements would spring up like mushrooms after rain. Take Roanoke, Virginia, for example. Before the railroads arrived, it was just another sleepy mountain community called Big Lick. Not exactly the most inspiring name. Then the Norfolk and Western Railway decided to build a major junction there in the 1880s. Suddenly, Big Lick transformed into a booming railroad hub with thousands of jobs. They even changed the name to something that sounded more respectable. Well, not every town got so lucky. The railroad companies had to make choices about where their tracks would go, and those choices were brutal. Some settlements that had existed for decades found themselves completely bypassed. The iron path might run just 5 miles away, but it might as well have been 500 miles. Without railroad access, these communities slowly withered away while their neighbors prospered. Then there were the towns that got directly crushed. Railroad companies had legal powers that seem almost unbelievable today. They could claim private property through eminent domain, demolish entire neighborhoods, and reroute rivers if it suited their purposes. Families who had lived in the same spot for generations were told to pack up and move. The railroad was coming through whether they liked it or not. The speed of change was mind-boggling. A quiet mountain valley could transform into a bustling industrial center within just a few years. Workers poured in from all over the country, bringing different languages, customs, and ideas. Local stores couldn't keep up with demand. Housing became scarce. Prices skyrocketed. But this was only the beginning of the railroad's grip on Appalachia. The companies weren't satisfied with just laying tracks and running trains. They had much bigger ambitions, ones that would reshape entire communities and concentrate power in ways that would make today's tech giants look modest. The railroad companies didn't just build tracks through Appalachian valleys, they built entire worlds. These weren't your typical American towns that grew naturally over decades. Nope, railway bosses would roll up to an empty stretch of land, snap their fingers, and boom, instant civilization. Well, sort of. Company towns sprouted like mushrooms after rain. Railroad executives would lay out neat rows of identical houses, each painted the same drab color. They'd slap together a general store, maybe a school, and definitely a church. The workers got housing, but here's the catch. Everything belonged to the company. Your house? Company property. The store where you bought groceries? Company owned. Even the preacher's salary came from railroad money. Workers paid rent to live in company houses and shopped at company stores with company scrip instead of real money. It was like playing Monopoly, except one player owned everything from the start and made all the rules. Makes sense, right? Then there's the matter of control. Railroad barons didn't just employ people, they controlled their entire existence. Step out of line at work, and you'd find yourself homeless by evening, complain about wages, and good luck finding another job within 50 miles. Some company bosses even decided who could get married and where children could go to school. But the real drama happened when rival railroad companies wanted the same piece of territory. Picture two kids fighting over the last piece of cake, except these kids had dynamite and armies of workers ready to swing pickaxes. The so-called rail wars turned mountain valleys into battlegrounds. Companies would race to claim the best river routes and mountain passes. Whoever got there first could charge competitors huge fees to cross their tracks or just block them entirely. Engineering crews worked day and night, sometimes by torchlight, trying to beat their rivals to strategic locations. And the weird part is, towns would pick sides like it was some kind of sporting event. Local politicians, sheriffs, even store owners would throw their support behind one railroad or another. Smart money usually backed the company that promised the most jobs and development. Take Irwin, Tennessee, for example. This sleepy mountain settlement exploded almost overnight when the railroad arrived. New industries followed those steel rails like moths to a flame. Lumber mills, brick factories, and manufacturing plants sprouted up faster than you could count them. By 1910, some of these railroad boomtowns had doubled or tripled in size within just 10 years. The promise was intoxicating: steady work, modern conveniences, connection to the wider world. Families packed up their belongings and flocked to these new industrial centers, dreaming of prosperity and progress. Yet beneath all this rapid growth, tensions were building. Competition between railroad companies was getting nastier by the day. Workers were getting fed up with company control over every aspect of their lives. The mountains themselves seemed to groan under the weight of all this change. What happened next would make those early rail wars look like playground squabbles. When two railroad companies wanted the same piece of mountain real estate, things got ugly fast. We're talking about grown men with dynamite and serious grudges here. The Norfolk and Western Railroad and the Virginian Railway both had their eyes on the same valley in West Virginia around 1909. Both companies needed that exact route to haul coal efficiently. Neither was backing down. What happened next makes modern corporate disputes look like playground squabbles. Railroad crews would show up at dawn, ready to lay track, only to find their rivals already there with shovels and surveying equipment. The first response was usually shouting, the second was fistfights. By the third day, someone was reaching for explosives. Then there's the legendary Battle of Matewan Gap, where two competing rail lines turned a peaceful hollow into something resembling a war zone. Local townspeople picked sides like they were choosing teams for baseball, except instead of bats and gloves, folks were grabbing shotguns and pickaxes. The Chesapeake and Ohio Railway learned this lesson the hard way when they tried to cross Baltimore and Ohio territory near Harper's Ferry. B&O workers didn't just file a complaint with lawyers, they formed armed patrols and literally blocked the mountain passes. Any C&O crew that showed up found themselves staring down the barrels of hunting rifles held by very determined railroad men. Makes sense when you think about it, right? These weren't just business disputes. Every mile of track meant jobs for hundreds of families. Lose the railroad war, and your entire town might dry up and blow away. Well, the violence escalated quickly beyond anyone's expectations. Railroad companies started hiring what they politely called security forces. These were basically mercenaries with a taste for trouble. They'd sneak through the forests at night, pulling up freshly laid rails or setting fire to equipment. Sometimes they'd plant charges under bridges their rivals had just finished building. Local sheriffs found themselves in impossible positions. Half the town worked for one railroad, half for another. Taking sides meant making enemies of your own neighbors. Some lawmen tried staying neutral and ended up getting shot at by both sides. But the weirdest part, towns would literally choose sides like they were joining different armies. Bluefield residents might support Norfolk and Western, while folks in nearby Princeton backed the Virginian line. Family dinners got awkward when your brother-in-law worked for the enemy railroad. The Chester Creek incident shows how far things went. Rival crews met head-on in a narrow valley where only one set of tracks could fit. Instead of negotiating, both sides started throwing rocks. Then came the dynamite. The explosion could be heard 15 miles away and left a crater that's still visible today. By 1912, these railroad wars had turned parts of Appalachia into armed camps. Federal marshals had to patrol some areas just to keep the peace. Every morning, railroad supervisors wondered if their crews would make it home alive. The violence was getting out of hand, but something even bigger was brewing that would make these corporate battles look like warm-up acts. Workers across America were already angry in 1877. Railroad companies had slashed wages while their owners got richer. Then the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad cut pay by another 10%. That was the last straw. The strike started in West Virginia and spread like wildfire through every railroad town in Appalachia. Workers didn't just walk off the job, they shut everything down completely. Trains couldn't move. Freight sat rotting in stations. The entire mountain region came to a grinding halt. But here's where it gets interesting. This wasn't just railroad workers throwing a tantrum. Canal boatmen joined in, furious that trains had been stealing their business for years. Coal miners dropped their tools and marched to the tracks. Even townspeople, who had nothing to do with railroads, started supporting the strikers. Why? Because everyone was tired of these big companies controlling their lives. The railroad bosses panicked. They tried bringing in replacement workers from other states, but the strikers had a clever plan. They knew every mountain pass, every hidden trail, every shortcut through the forests. When scab workers tried to reach the trains, strikers would ambush them from the woods. Not with guns, well, not always, but with rocks, sticks, and sheer intimidation. In some towns, strikers pulled up entire sections of track. Others built massive log barriers across the rails. A few groups even figured out how to disable the engines themselves, leaving expensive locomotives sitting useless in the middle of nowhere. The railroad companies were losing thousands of dollars every day. Then there's the story of Martinsburg, West Virginia. Strikers there didn't just block the trains. They held the entire rail yard hostage. When the local militia showed up to restore order, half the soldiers refused to fight their own neighbors and friends. Makes sense, right? These weren't outside agitators. These were their brothers, cousins, and drinking buddies. Federal troops finally arrived with orders to break the strike by any means necessary. The mountains erupted in violence. Soldiers chased strikers through dense forests. Gunfights broke out at remote crossings. Some strikers used their knowledge of the terrain to lead troops into box canyons and dead ends, then disappeared like ghosts. The human cost was brutal. At least 20 people died in West Virginia alone. Dozens more were injured or arrested. Families lost their breadwinners. Local businesses that depended on train traffic nearly went bankrupt. After 2 weeks of chaos, the strike finally collapsed. Federal force and exhaustion won out over worker anger. But the railroad companies learned something important. These mountain people wouldn't be pushed around easily. They tightened security, hired private guards, and started building company towns where they could control every aspect of workers' lives. The 1877 strike changed everything in Appalachian railroad towns. Workers began forming stronger unions, preparing for future battles. Company bosses became more paranoid and controlling. The stage was set for decades of conflict between corporate power and mountain independence. The immediate crisis had passed, but the real transformation of Appalachian life was just beginning. When the railroad wars finally ended, the mountains looked like a giant had reshuffled the deck. Towns that backed the winning railroad companies suddenly found themselves sitting pretty. Their populations exploded, businesses thrived, and money flowed like water after a spring thaw. But the losers, well, they got to watch their neighbors disappear one family at a time. Take Cass, West Virginia. This place used to buzz with activity when the lumber trains rolled through daily. Workers filled the company houses, kids played in the streets, and the general store stayed open late. Now it's basically a museum where tourists come to ride old trains and pretend they're living in the past. The weird part is how quickly it all happened. One decade you're a booming railroad town, the next you're selling postcards to visitors. Then there's the trust issue. Appalachian folks have long memories, especially when it comes to outsiders making big promises. Their great-grandparents watched railroad barons roll into town, promise prosperity, then control every aspect of daily life. Makes sense why many mountain communities still eye corporate newcomers with suspicion, right? That skepticism runs deeper than coal veins. But here's where the story takes another sharp turn. Just when railroads seemed unstoppable, highways started creeping through the mountains in the mid-1900s. Suddenly, people could drive their own cars instead of waiting for train schedules. Trucks could haul goods directly to businesses without stopping at every depot along the way. The iron horse that had conquered the mountains was getting outrun by rubber tires and asphalt. Some railroad towns adapted by reinventing themselves. Others simply faded away like morning mist. The irony hits hard when you realize these communities that fought so desperately for railroad access eventually watched those same tracks become obsolete. Progress has a twisted sense of humor sometimes. Let's not forget how this reshaping created invisible boundaries that still exist today. Drive through Appalachia, and you'll notice something strange. Some towns feel connected to the wider world, while others seem frozen in time. Those differences often trace back to which side won those old railroad battles. The winning towns got better infrastructure, more investment, and stronger connections to outside markets. The losing towns got left behind, creating economic gaps that persist generations later. What's fascinating is how the physical railroad routes still matter. Even abandoned tracks influence where new roads get built, where businesses locate, and how communities connect with each other. Urban planners call this path dependence. Basically, old decisions keep shaping new ones, whether we realize it or not. The railroad wars might seem like ancient history, but their fingerprints cover everything in modern Appalachia. Property lines, voting patterns, family feuds, economic opportunities, they all bear traces of those violent struggles over iron rails and steam engines. Today's Appalachian residents live in a landscape permanently altered by those railroad battles. Some inherited prosperity, others inherited isolation. All inherited a healthy skepticism about outsiders bearing promises of progress. The mountains remember everything, especially the price of picking the wrong side when powerful interests come calling.